It's preparing for the live stream. All right, and we are live. Good morning. Thank you everyone for joining us this morning. My name is Sarah Gottwallace, and I am one of the co-chairs of the Dr. Talbot Spivak Holocaust Memorial Committee. This morning, we have the honor and the privilege of hearing from Dr. Stuart Mest, and he is actually a second generation, a G2. His parents were both Holocaust survivors. So this morning, we have a very interesting, very unique perspective that perhaps you haven't heard before. I myself, even though I'm a Holocaust historian, I haven't heard the story very often from the perspective of the children of survivors. And obviously, as we continue on into the future, we're going to be hearing more and more of these stories from this perspective, right? So just as I tell my students, anytime we're listening to a Holocaust survivor, listening to any story of survival and perspective is so very vitally important going into the future. Not only so that we can continue to glean and gain more information that will help with Holocaust memory and memorialization and education, but also so that we can stand up in the face of Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, we are seeing a rise, I started to say in the country, but globally, we are seeing a rise in Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism. And it is going to be up to us and our generations and our future generations to stand up against this wrong and go to a Holocaust denier and say, you are wrong and I will not allow you to spread your lies. I know that the Holocaust happened. I met someone, I met their children, I heard the stories, and we just have to stamp out this ugliness that exists in the world. And it is only through listening to these stories, remembering these stories, and continuing to share these stories and the truth that we will be able to do so. So Dr. Mest has a very, very interesting story and perspective to share with us this morning. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Stuart Mest.
Well, thank you, and good morning, everyone. And thank you for allowing me to participate in the Dr. Spivak Holocaust Memorial Week. I wanted to first start out by going over the definition of the Holocaust. It is the state-sponsored, systematic persecution and annihilation of European Jewry by Nazi Germany and its collaborators from 1933 to 1945. It's a complex definition fitting a complex subject. And we talk about the numbers in the abstract. 6 million souls perished out of the 9 million Jewish people living in Europe at that time. 2/3 perish. Out of the 6 million, 1.5 million children. That was the real target of the Nazis. So the chances of a child surviving the Holocaust is about 6 to 8%. And today, we're going to see how the Holocaust affected 2 individuals, my parents. Getting back to the definition, I do want to point out that I feel the most important word in the definition is collaborators. There were passive collaborators who just stood idly by and watched what happened and said nothing for various reasons. Some was from fear, some was maybe that they sort of partially agreed. And then there were the active collaborators in Germany and in the countries that Germany conquered that actively participated in genocide. We need to point out that the root of the Holocaust is anti-Semitism, hatred of the Jewish people based on myths, stereotypes, tropes that are really not based in reality and have been around since the beginning of time, really dating back to the hieroglyphics. You can see evidence of it in the hieroglyphics in Egypt. The blood libel has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, saying that Jewish people murder Christian children and use their blood to drink it or to use it in cooking. And then, of course, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was published by the Russian security services in the late 1800s, which stated that the Jews were plotting to take over the world. And this was propagated all over the world, as well as in our country. And the reasons for anti-Semitism were political, cultural, religious, economic. When we talk about the Holocaust and the Nazi movement, we need to really broach on the subject of the pseudoscience of eugenics, the belief in the superiority of the Aryan, Nordic, and Anglo-Saxon peoples, which was very, very much accepted in German society, as it was in America. It began in the late 1800s in England and spread through the world. And in fact, it was very popular in our country up until the beginning of World War II. The Nazi Party argued that they needed to, quote unquote, heal the German society. As early as 1920, two professors in Germany, Karl Binding and Alfred Huck, published a treatise which medicalized the concept of therapeutic killing. They argued that destroying life unworthy of life is purely a healing treatment consistent with medical ethics. This was accepted in the universities. The Nuremberg race laws, which were passed in 1935, or after Hitler had already taken power, was considered a public health measure. So the Nazi philosophy and ideologies were couched in medical terminology. The German Medical Society was disillusioned with changes in medicine in the Weimar Republic in the 1920s into the 1930s. Young German physicians could not earn a living. Medical schools already started teaching eugenics in their curriculum in the late 1920s. The physicians wanted to be part of the healing of the German society, or the German Volk. When we look at numbers, approximately 10% of the German citizens were active members of the Nazi Party, but yet nearly 50% of the physicians in Germany were members of the Nazi Party. They had the highest percentage of any profession. Next were attorneys, which were roughly 25 to 30%. The physicians saw that the Nazi Party was going to save the practice of medicine, allow the healing of German society, and I would suspect that some physicians saw it as an opportunity for self-advancement, for university tenure, and things like that. Once Hitler came into power, one of the first laws enacted was the Sterilization Laws, in which physically and mentally handicapped individuals were sterilized. Physicians were actively involved in the writing of the law, in overseeing the law, in carrying out the sterilizations, because they felt that this was needed to heal German society. And as we know, this sterilization program morphed itself into the T4 euthanasia program, which began in 1939, in which physically handicapped, mentally handicapped people were euthanized. They were killed because this was a way to heal German society. The physicians were actively involved in overseeing this, in implementing it, designing ways to euthanize these individuals, either by starving young children, utilizing lethal injections, such as using phenol injections into the heart. And they were using primitive gas chambers at that time and perfecting the Zyklon B poisonous gas. It's estimated that the T4 euthanasia program, beginning in 1939, and supposedly ending in 1941 when the German people heard about it and were very upset about it, and Hitler said he stopped it. But in fact, it continued all through World War II as the 14 F-13 program in the concentration camp system, as well as in all the occupied countries in which soldiers would go into nursing homes, psychiatric facilities, remove patients, and euthanize them. Probably close to 400,000 people were slaughtered this way. In the extermination camps, such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, the Zyklon B poisonous gas was transported utilizing Red Cross vehicles and the officers wearing white coats, all to show that the murder that occurred in the extermination camps was a medical process. The horrendous experiments carried out in the concentration camp system were rationalized as saving German lives, and the prisoners were going to die anyway, so it was okay to do horrendous experiments. The Germans came up with a ghetto system all through Europe, especially Eastern Europe, in which Jews were segregated, and they couched it saying that they needed to quarantine the Jews because they transmitted diseases such as typhus, etc. And as a physician myself, it's very disturbing to look at all the evidence that occurred in Germany in the 1920s, 1930s, and through World War II, and see how physicians acted and behaved and thought. And it's hard for me to even grasp any of this. And we need to learn from what happened back then. And I think we have, with the Nuremberg Code coming out of the doctor's trial in Nuremberg, in which Nazi physicians were captured and placed on trial, setting up guidelines for experimentation, testing on various products, and things like that. But we always, in the field of medicine, have to be on guard with new techniques, new technology. So now I'd like to discuss how the Holocaust affected two people, my parents, Joel and Toby Mest. Here we see a map of Europe at the beginning of the war, and we see the routes that the Germans took to enter Poland. And my father was born in the city of Lodz, and my mother was born in a small village, Tysovsha, which is right near the Lublin area. And you can see this is the line in which the Soviet Union took over this part of Western Poland as part of the agreement that Hitler and Stalin had come to before the beginning of World War II. My dad was born June 23rd, 1925 in the city of Lodz. It was a very large industrial city, as it is today. He lived with his father and mother and younger brother in an apartment building in a neighborhood where Jewish and non-Jewish people lived. Sarah, is everyone seeing my slides? I just want to make sure.
Yes, sir, you're good to go. Perfect.
They listened to the radio and were aware of Hitler and the events that were occurring in Germany. And I would ask him, what were you and your friends thinking of? He was 14 years old at the time. He was a teenager. He had just had his bar mitzvah the year before. And he and his friends truly felt that the world, especially the United States, would step in and stop Hitler. And how so wrong he was. He vividly remembers the German troops marching into the city of Lodz the second week of September 1939. They stormed into the apartment building that he was living in. The non-Jewish residents in the apartment building identified his family as Jewish, as well as other families in the apartment building. The soldiers came into the apartment building, said, "You're a Jew." They gave his mom the Stars of David. They told him that they had to present them when they're outside. So his mom sewed them on their back of their jackets. There was a curfew instituted in the city, and he was no longer able to go to school. Once the German army installed their government in the city of Lodz, they began planning the Lodz ghetto, as they did in every city and village and small town in Poland and in Eastern Europe, in which they would segregate the Jewish people. They generally chose an area that was the most undeveloped part of the city, and that's what they did in the city of Lodz. They took a 1 square mile area in the northwest section of the city and created the Lodz ghetto. And in the winter of 1940, they started moving people into the ghetto. 150,000 Jewish people in a 1 square mile area. He and his family shared a small apartment with 1 bathroom with 2 other families, and the toilet did not function properly. Now, sewage system wasn't that great in the city of Lodz to begin with, but in the area in which they created the ghetto, the sewage system was very poor. And so you can imagine what the conditions were like. There was raw sewage on the streets. And when you have raw sewage, you have unclean water, and infectious diseases such as salmonella occurs pretty quickly because of impure water and because of overcrowding, people not being able to bathe properly. Typhus spreads rampantly in the ghetto. And that was the idea. This way, people died from infectious diseases. And who were the first to die in the ghettos? Were the elderly who had severe medical issues, but it was the children who died initially. And as Hitler called them, they were worthless mouths to feed. In the ghetto, there was food rationing. Initially, people received less than 1,000 calories a day. As the war progressed, it went down to 200 to 300 calories a day. That's not enough food to sustain yourself. And again, that was the idea. People were starved to death, so they were physically weakened. In the city of Lodz, as in other ghettos, a Jewish council ran the ghetto under Nazi supervision. There was a Jewish police force to keep the peace. There was actually a fire force to put out fires. They had a crew to clean up the raw sewage that was on the streets. Chaim Rumkowski, who was the head of the Jewish council in Lodz, had an idea to create factories throughout the ghetto where goods would be produced. And he felt that this would stave off elimination. And in a way, it did. My father worked in a leather factory making saddles for the German army. He would work 7 days a week, 12 to 14 hours a day. He would get up in the morning, he told us, he would go outside and you would be walking down the street and you would walk over dead bodies on the street and walk over the raw sewage on the streets and get to the factory on time, work your shift. They would give you a little bit of extra food because you were working, which he took home with him for his family. This is what you did every day. As we learned after the war, the factories were very, very profitable for the German government, as the goods that were produced there were sold or brought back to Germany. I remember in the 1960s, he said it was dehumanization in the ghetto. That's what life was like. You just existed. You were not alive. So they physically beat you down by starving you, and they psychologically beat you down so you couldn't resist based on the existence that you lived in. As we know, the Vinci Conference occurred in January of 1942, in which essentially the final solution was authorized. There is no written account, there's no written letter or law signed by Adolf Hitler. Everything was done verbally. The minutes of the Vinci Conference were recovered by the Allies after the war, and as we know, Adolf Eichmann was the secretary, and the minutes were sanitized. But the final solution was approved. And then the deportations started to the extermination camps soon thereafter. The technology, the science, the knowledge that was obtained in the 1930s through the sterilization program and the euthanasia program, which we discussed, were used and placed in the extermination camps, such that the gas chambers worked much more efficiently. They perfected the crematorium, and thus they medicalized and industrialized genocide. This is an example of a cattle car that was used to transport individuals. It's not a railway car, it's a cattle car that was used to transport cattle. There was really no window, there was a little slot on the top. There was no heat, there was no air conditioning, there was no food, there was no water, there were no bathroom facilities. There was a bucket in the middle that was needed to be used. They would place 70 to 80 to 120 people in each cattle car. This occurred every day, and the long line of cattle cars would go to the extermination facilities such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Chelmno. In the Lodz Ghetto, transports did occur in 1942, but then they stopped because of how profitable the Lodz Ghetto was, and the transports did not start again from the Lodz Ghetto until 1944. My father was transported to Auschwitz along with his family on August 10th, 1944. He vividly remembered the cattle car ride to Auschwitz. No food, no waters, no windows. He did not know where he was going. They received a telegram that made it official. They were told to report to the train station, as the ghettos were always right near a train station. And he was told to bring his personal belongings, and they arrived, packed into the cattle car, and on August 10th, in the middle of the summer, it was a 24-hour ride, no food, no water. And when they got there, he realized where he was. They were taken out of the cattle cars, and there was separation and a selection process. His mother was sent to the gas chamber, and he never saw her again. He and his younger brother went through the selection process, but his brother had a physical ailment that he was born with, and he walked with a limp. When you arrived at the extermination camps, there was a selection process. Initially, in 1942, it was a military officer who made the selection whether you were going to be sent to your death in the gas chamber or utilized for work, because slave labor was very important for the German economy, as every able-bodied German male was in the military. The hierarchy said that this was inefficient, and they needed a physician to make the selection, as a physician would have a better idea who could work for a week or a month or 8 weeks to get as much slave labor as they could. In Auschwitz, there were many physicians, one of which was Dr. Joseph Mengele, MD, PhD. His PhD was in anthropology, and he, as we know, did multiple experiments in Auschwitz, especially on identical twins. On the day that my father and his younger brother arrived at Auschwitz, there were no identical twins. So Dr. Mengele was very upset that day. My father recalled, screaming and yelling. So he then went and pulled out children who had physical defects and lined them up on the train tracks. And he called out that the experiment that day was to see how long it would take a Jew to fall to the ground once his brainstem was transected. Brainstem is in the back part of the brain, controlling balance, wakefulness. And he lined these individuals up, and he had his attendant next to him with a clipboard and a stopwatch. And he went behind each of these people. He had his pistol in his hand, and he shot them in the back of the head. And my father watched as Dr. Mengele murdered his brother. My father was chosen to work, and he was at Auschwitz for about a month, and he was subsequently transferred to Dachau concentration camp, to a satellite camp, Kaufering, prisoner number 96865, and he worked in a quarry and a burial detail. He was liberated by the US military April 29, 1945. At the time, he had a very high fever, he was delirious, he was malnourished, and he had typhus. He was just laying there, and an American soldier realized that he was still alive, and he was hospitalized in a makeshift hospital and was able to survive. He weighed about 50 pounds at that time. He was in the hospital for a while and then subsequently released. He was placed in a displaced persons camp, which the Allies constructed multiple DP camps in Germany, Austria, and there was one in Italy. The initial conditions in the DP camps were terrible. There wasn't food, there wasn't adequate health care, there weren't adequate provisions for living, beds, cots. Word of this came back to President Truman, who had a commission formed, a study was done, and things changed rather quickly. One of the things that changed was that the Jewish prisoners would be kept separate from the non-Jewish prisoners, because people were labeled as displaced based on their nation of origin. So initially he was placed with other Polish people who had nowhere to go. And the Jewish people felt unsafe in that kind of an environment, as they may have been in the same barracks with someone who had tried to kill them during the war. So he was then subsequently transferred to Camp Feldefink, which was a Jewish DP camp, and he was there for 4 years. His education resumed in the DP camps as schools were set up, vocational training was set up in the camps, and the US military actually taught him how to drive large trucks. So he had the equivalent of a CDL license when he came to the States. It was a long process to come to America or Canada or Australia or other countries after the war. You had to have a sponsor who had to place a bond, basically issue a bond for you, put up money, show that you would have a job, a place to live when you came to the United States or Canada. And he had a distant cousin sponsor him, but because of the immigration laws after the war were still very stringent, dating back to 1923 from the Reed-Johnson Act, which basically our immigration law was a quota system based on the 1890 census numbers. People arriving from Eastern Europe were very limited in number. But life sort of returned to normal in the DP camps. They had their own currency. Organizations flourished. This is a picture of my dad in his 1948 in his DP camp photo. Initially, they were guarded by American soldiers rather than German soldiers or the SS. And they were prisoners in the DP camp. You weren't allowed to leave. You weren't even allowed to leave the sector that you were assigned to. But then eventually they would let them out of the camp. He emigrated to the United States August 17, 1949, arriving on the US General C.C. Bellon. And he met his future wife, my mom, while attending night school. He had already finished his schooling in the DP camp, but he wanted to get a GED certificate. They were married New Year's Eve, 1950, and applied for citizenship, which he received March 29th, 1955. That was his application declaring his intent to become a US citizen. And this is his citizenship papers, March 29th, 1955. They were living in Brooklyn at the time. That was one of the happiest days in their lives, they both would say, when they got their US citizenship. Now, my father came to the States and he went to work the next day because his distant cousins who sponsored him had arranged for an apartment and for him to have a job. And he spoke English at the time because he learned English in the DP camps. And he figured out how to get to the work site, and he showed up for work that day. And he said his name, and the boss said, "Yes, I know you were coming today." And he was a delivery man driving a delivery truck for a company. And the gentleman told my father that the truck was already loaded and he had lots of deliveries to make. He gave my father the schedule of deliveries and he gave him a map and told him to get to work. And my father looked at this list and he gave him a map and he said, "How am I supposed to do all this? I'm just in the country for one day." And the owner of the business said, he says, "I know your story. You were in Lodz, Poland. You survived the Lodz ghetto. You were transported to Auschwitz. You survived Auschwitz. Miraculously, you were then transferred to Dachau and survived Dachau, even though you were sick as can be. he says, you'll figure this out and you will make the deliveries. I have confidence in you. And by midnight that night, my father said he had made all those deliveries using a map, trying to figure his way out through Brooklyn, New York in 1949, excuse me. Now, just getting back to the cattle cars and the transports, we went to see the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in the early 1990s after it had opened up. And my mom had already passed away by then. She had died at a young age. But my father wanted to see the museum in Washington. And so we drove down. He wanted to make sure that it was real, that they didn't gloss over what happened. And I said, okay. And we went to the museum and we went through it, and he was silent the entire time. And in the museum, there's an open cattle car. And he went and sat in it, and he was in there for quite some time. Just staring, his hands over his eyes. And on our ride back from Washington up 95 North, I said, so what did you think of the museum? And he said, yeah, it was good, he said. It didn't whitewash what happened. It tried to show what really did happen. And I said, well, that was good. And I said, you were sitting in that cattle car for a long time and didn't say anything. And he said, yeah, he was just thinking. And he was recalling the day he was transported from the Lodz ghetto to Auschwitz, and then his ride in the cattle car from Auschwitz to Dachau. And then he said, as he was sitting there, he heard the cries and felt the souls of those who had been in that cattle car. So that's why we need to talk about the Holocaust. That's why we need to teach the lessons of the Holocaust to inspire action against bigotry, hatred, and violence. So we're going to talk about my mom, Toby Mest, or by her Polish name, Topka, and her maiden name was Schwartz. She was born February 13th, 1933, in a small village, Tuszówce, Poland, which no longer exists. If you've ever seen Fiddler on the Roof, Anatevka, a small village in which Fiddler the Milkman lived, that's where my mother was born and lived. She lived with her mom and dad when Germany invaded in 1939. She was 6 years old. So she stayed with her parents. Now, some of her older siblings fled to Russia at the time because they were right near the border with the Soviet Union. And they were captured immediately, as the Russians and Stalin said that they were spies, and they were sent off to work camps in Siberia where they miraculously survived. This is a picture of Tuszówce, Poland. Small little houses, rural agricultural village, small shops. Her father died at the end of 1939. She stayed with her mother in the ghetto as the whole town was turned into a ghetto. It was surrounded by barbed wire, and the Germans said that they would be back. Well, they were going to be back once the extermination camps were built, and that they would be transported starting in 1942 to their death. Her mom got really sick, and in 1942 said, you got to go save yourself. So my mom's 9 years old, and she manages to escape from the ghetto through a hole in the barbed wire. And it's then that she came in contact with the partisans and the underground in the forest areas. And you have to remember that food was very limited at that time. Partisans were supported somewhat by the Soviets. And they told her she was too young to be given a weapon. And she would describe how they would hide all day in bunkers, which they called, which were really deep holes dug in the forest areas covered by brush and tree limbs. He had to be as still as possible as the German troops looked for Jews and partisans in the forest areas every day, all day. At night, she would leave the bunker to look for water and food. And there were many days in which she had no solid food. Many, many days, just surviving on a little bit of water. And she would have to fend for herself. She would go from village to village, pretending she was not Jewish. She made up a name and she was an orphan, which she was. And some people would give her some food or clothes and even take her in for a short period of time when they saw this little girl. But there were couples who would just take her in and they would turn her into the Nazis, or try to, because you would get a 5-pound bag of sugar if you turned in a Jewish kid to the Nazis. And 5-pound bag of sugar during World War II was like a 5-pound bag of gold. And as we said at the beginning, the target were the kids. And so a Jewish kid turned into the Nazis was the ultimate. And she escaped a couple of times as people tried to turn her in. She was severely malnourished, tired, as the winter of 1944 to 1945 was approaching. She was about 11, 12 years old. And a Polish couple took her into their home. They fed her, they clothed her, and they told the neighbors that she was a relative. And my mom went to church every Sunday. She learned the Catholic prayers. And she stayed with this couple until the end of the war, when she revealed to them her true identity and what town she came from. She then returned to the village, and there was nothing left. And she was subsequently rounded up by the American soldiers, and she went to a DP camp in Bamberg, Germany for the next 4 years. Here's a picture of the outside of the DP camp in Bamberg, and you see American military officer patrolling and guarding, and you see some small kids. Again, she said living conditions were not good at the beginning and did improve over the 4 years that they were there. And she said initially she had a cot and a blanket, a little pillow, and she would always say at least nobody was trying to kill her and shoot at her, so it was good. There's a picture of my mom in 1949 in the DP camp. She was 16 years old at the time. She resumed her education in the DP camp, learned English, knew how to speak other languages, including Polish. And she came to the United States in July 1949, a month ahead of my father, on the US General Heinzelman. She actually arrived in Boston and then was transported to Ellis Island in New York. And she too went to work the day after arriving in the United States, as her uncle who sponsored her immigration had secured an apartment and a job for her. And she met my dad at night because she too wanted to get her GED certificate. And as I said before, they married New Year's Eve 1950, and 5 years, they immediately applied for citizenship papers, and she became a citizen in 1955. She always would tell the story that you would go up individually at that time. It's different now. And the judge would interview you and ask you questions. And he told her she did a good job and that she would be a US citizen. Again, one of the happiest days in my parents' lives when they became citizens of the United States. Now, my mom kept in touch with the Polish couple that she lived with for the last 5 to 6 months of the war after she had emigrated. She would write letters to them on a frequent basis and send them gifts, birthday gifts, Christmas gifts. And she really kept in contact with them until they both died. That was my mom's certificate applying for citizenship. And that's her citizenship papers, March 22nd, 1955, as they were living in Brooklyn. That's their engagement picture and their wedding picture, New Year's Eve, 1950. And people would not really talk about the Holocaust back then, except if you were a survivor. But some people would say, well, come to my parents and they say, why was there so little resistance by the Jewish people during the Holocaust? And that really infuriated my parents. They would respond by saying they had no weapons or armies at their disposal. And they would continue by saying that the ultimate resistance was survival, to tell the world what happened and make sure that another generation of Jewish children would be born, as 1.5 million Jewish children's lives were snuffed out. And they did. They were married and had 2 children, my older brother and I, and my older brother just passed away in May of this year. So they achieved their goal of surviving, telling their story, and making sure that the world knows what happened, and that with the hope that it will never happen again. Now, as a as a child of survivors, there's been a lot of myths about the children of survivors. I would call them myths, that as a group that we had a lot of anxiety issues, depressive issues. And in fact, there was a study published in the 1960s in Canada saying, indeed, that we had a high incidence of depression, anxiety, etc. But multiple studies were published. And when you look retrospectively at all those studies, that the 2 Gs, children of one parent, if one of their parents or both parents were survivors, really had no higher incidence of psychiatric issues like anxiety and depression in the general population. And in fact, that we were very well adjusted given our environment in which we were raised. Most children or survivors went into fields that helped people, social work, teachers, medical professions. And there has also been a lot of study, especially recently, about the intergenerational effects of trauma, which has now been called epigenetics, in which our parents who suffered through the Holocaust would have markers on their genes which allowed them to survive, and whether those altered genes were then transmitted to us with the chemical mark on them, such that we would then express our genes differently than they were originally programmed. And that's really a lot of discussion about that now, whether it's true and valid or not. And we will see over the next 10, 20, 30 years, as the science and technology improves, whether indeed that is indeed the case. Now, obviously, growing up in a home in which both of your parents are survivors does have an effect on you. Our parents were very, very protective of us, knowing where we were, all the time, making sure that we're okay for obvious reasons, and such that I think we are then very devoted to our parents and sometimes overprotective of them as we were growing up to make sure that they were okay. And I think looking back, I'm sure that's true. You never really wanted to do anything that would upset your parents because of everything that they went through. When it came time to choosing a college, I know myself, I said to myself, I can't go very far away from home and leave my parents, as I was the baby, the younger one, and my brother was already through college and moved away. And so it did affect you way in your decision making in a way, but it was all for the good, not for in any adverse way. And I think it was all positive. Our parents were shining examples of how to live their lives. They were, for everything that they went through, they were the most kind, generous, considerate people. I remember once we were, for anyone knowing Northeast Philly, that's where I was born and grew up, we were riding on the Roosevelt Boulevard and my father saw a homeless person on the street. And he pulls the car over and stops and he and my mother get out and they want to see if they can help this person. I don't know how many people today would do that, but back then, that's what they did. And they were a shining example for me how to lead my life in a proper, kind, generous way. So we, as a group of people, as a society, as a country, as the world, need to continue studying the Holocaust such that we can learn the lessons from the Holocaust to inspire action against bigotry, hatred, and violence, which is the mission statement of Army Holocaust Museum in Naples, Florida. Now, I want to conclude by reading one of Elie Wiesel's most famous quotes. I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mest. That was phenomenal. That's an excellent presentation, excellent story. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. So if anybody has any questions, make sure that you're signed into YouTube. That always helps. So if you've been trying to type anything out and it's not working, you have to sign up to YouTube and relay any of those questions, type any of those questions in rather, and I will relay those to Dr. Mest. Amazing story. And Ashrith says, nice picture of the wedding. It is a lovely picture of the wedding. Your parents were beautiful people inside and out. I'm so glad that they shared their story with you and that you are sharing their story with us. So we do have a few questions here, but first I'm going to be selfish and ask one of mine because it does kind of go along with what I just said. When did your parents tell you and your brother about their story? Did you always know? Did they wait for you to get to a certain age? And did they continue to give you more detail, you know, as you got older and you were able to hear about, you know, your father stepping over bodies and that sort of thing?
Yeah, they never just sat us down and said, here, we're going to talk about what happened to us. No, they never did that. It would always be at the dinner table, or if we were sitting there having a conversation about something and they felt it was appropriate to then share a detail, a story as a teaching point for my brother and I. I recall one time we were at the dinner table and my mom, you know, made dinner and we sat down and my brother didn't like what my mother made. And so then my father would then start talking about the ghetto and no food. Yeah. And then in the concentration camp no food. And if you did get food, you got a moldy potato in the morning with some clear broth. That was your sustenance for the day. And no silverware, no clean plate, nothing. So he looked at my brother and said, you have food on a plate with a nice silverware. You can eat it. But he went on, and that's when we started talking about the ghetto and how they didn't have any food. And he relayed all that. My mom then talked about how in the forest they had no food and they were starving to death for days. And if somebody gave them some food, you were thankful for it.
Yes, absolutely. And obviously their stories inspired you not only to share their story, but you're on the board for the Holocaust Museum and Cohen Education Center, correct?
Correct, yes. And that's really exciting. And the museum has a wonderful mission and a lot of outreach in the schools. And we do a lot of work with the 5th graders, 8th graders, and high school students, as you know. And the museum continues to grow, and which is important. It's because of the lessons that we can learn from the Holocaust.
It's very important.
Right.
Ashraf asked, where is it here? Do you remember the names of the Polish couple who saved your mother for the last few months?
No, don't remember their name, because my mother would write letters on Saturday night after Sabbath ended. And we went through the ritual of Sabbath ending, and then she would sit and write letters. Nobody writes a letter anymore, but she did back then. And it was always in Polish. And so I picked it up, and I was little, and I said, what is this? And this isn't English, but my parents spoke Polish. And when they didn't want us to understand what they were talking about, they spoke in Polish. Otherwise, the rule was they spoke in English, and we answered in English, or they spoke in Yiddish, but we had to answer in English. Because when we went to school, we had to speak English. You couldn't speak Yiddish in school. So that was the rules in the house. And I said, well, this is not English and this isn't Yiddish. What is this? And then she said, oh, it's Polish. And I said, who are you writing to? And that's when she told me the whole story about this couple, but I do not recall their name. No, sorry.
Let's see, another question. Can you elaborate a little bit further on Dr. Mengele's experiments? Now, I am going to send, it was as another question from Ashworth. Ashworth, I'm going to email you a link from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum talking a little bit more about Dr. Mengele and his twin experiments. But Dr. Mest, if you'd like to elaborate a little bit more on what he did.
Sure. He was a brilliant man in terms of his educational experience, and he was a monster at the same time. And when you watch videos and testimonies of people he experimented on, they said he was handsome, charming, personal, and then he did horrible experiments on them because he mesmerized them in certain respects. But he wanted to do experiments on identical twins because they both would have identical genes. And he would do an experiment on one, either injecting them with substances or chemicals to see an effect, or do a procedure on one and not the other. And then he would murder both of them simultaneously and do an autopsy on them. One of the things, because of his anthropology background, he wanted to have a way to look at a person and decide if they were Aryan or not, Aryan blood. So they would be saved, not sterilized, or brought back from whatever country that Germany had just occupied, bring them back to Germany and be raised by German Aryan parents. So if they could identify, and that's why he did these horrific experiments on eyes, and he injected people's eyes to see if he could change the pigment of their eye color. More so, it was really related to changing the expression of the genes that characterize your eye color. And people always write about, and in their testimonies, they talked about rapid heartbeat, feeling like they were going to faint when he gave them these injections. He injected epinephrine into their eyes to see if he could alter their genes. So in a way, German medical society was very advanced in their thinking but they took it to this extreme and did experiments like this to try to prove their point. And they wanted to see if they could alter the expression of genes. So that was the idea of the experiment. It's mind-boggling if you go through the experiments that the German physicians did in the concentration camps. And if anyone's interested, at the museum this year, I'm doing a two-part talk entitled Eugenics, Experiments, Ethics, Nazi Germany, Japan, and the United States, looking at what not German physicians did, Japanese physicians, and what we in our country were doing before and during World War II and afterwards, talking about eugenics, ethics, medical ethics, etc. It's on the Holocaust Museum's website if anyone's interested to register for those lectures.
And if you join the Holocaust Museum's newsletter, you'll also get a lot of important information notifying you of these. As I understand it, the museum is also starting to do profiles of second generation folks and put those into the newsletters as well. So everybody, this would be great. I mean, I've been on the newsletter for quite some time now, and it's a wonderful way to stay connected to our local Holocaust community and hear more of these stories as well. There are also a few really good books that you're bringing to mind here about Nazi doctors and eugenics. And I know that Robert J. Lifton is a really good author in this area. But, you know, I had totally forgotten. It slipped my mind. I'm so glad that you reminded me that Mengele was an anthropologist.
Correct.
Once you put that piece into the puzzle, it's like everything falls into place, of course. We currently, I'm just kind of killing time here until anybody asks more questions here, but I'm currently doing a little bit of research myself on a concentration camp where Hitler Youth men, young boys were sent, where it's like they had the correct look, they had the correct parentage, but they didn't have that right mentality. So they were using that concentration camp as sort of a re-education camp, really and truly. And they were experimenting on those young men and torturing those young men as well to try to pound that Aryan Nazi ideology into them. So
and what does that remind us of today with China and what's going on with the Uyghurs and the millions of people in camps for re-education purposes?
Unfortunately, we say never again, and maybe one day, but not in our past. You know, we say never again with the Holocaust, and then again and again and again, unfortunately.
Right.
Just horrible. It's so pivotal that we keep these genocides in mind, and the genocides predating the Holocaust. Dealing with the Armenian Genocide, 1915. It happened when World War I was going on. Very few people, especially in the United States, knew where Armenia was located, even though the New York Times was reporting the story that there was a genocide occurring, a religious genocide at that. People were saying, well, it's not here, it's somewhere else, and World War I is happening. So of course people are going to die. And Hitler himself said, who remembers the Armenian Genocide?
Right. We
have to remember all of these genocides, lest they be able to say who remembers such and such genocide as Hitler did.
Exactly.
Amazing. Well, I think that wraps up our questions. Thank you so much for your presentation today. You're going to be on my wish list for all of our future presentations, so I hope you enjoyed your experience today.
Oh, man.
Yes, thank you. If anybody has any additional questions for Dr. Mest, just get in touch with us and we'll relay those questions to him and get back to you. So thank you so much, everyone, for your time. And thank you again, Dr. Stuart Mest.
Well, thank you. Have a great day.
Have a great day. Goodbye, everyone.